In the 19th century, Australia was known as the working man's paradise. Tied into the Industrial Revolution as a supplier of raw wool to British manufacturing, and with wealth from the gold rushes of the 1850s, for a period from the mid-19th century towards the end of the 19th century, Australia was the richest country in the world. Australia is part of a group of countries known as the settler economies, usually considered to consist of the United States, Canada, Argentina, Australia and New Zealand, that shared several features. First of all, they were all countries where temperate zone agriculture could be carried out. So they had open savanna areas that were suitable for crops and raising livestock, usually which was imported from other parts of the world, and using agricultural technology that was also imported from other parts of the world. So all of these countries were relatively highly productive agricultural producers based on their natural geography. The second feature these countries shared was that they all had a relatively low density of indigenous population at the time of European colonisation. And so that meant that with technological advantage that the Europeans had, the European population quickly became the dominant population in these countries, both economically and in terms of size of population. The third characteristic these countries shared was that their early economic activity involved specialising in production of a small number of resource-intensive products which were exported back to Europe, underpinned by large-scale immigration to provide the workforce for that production activity and capital inflows from Europe to provide the funds for financing that economic activity. So if we think about that group of countries, in Australia we think in the 19th century of wool and wheat being the key products that were exported to Europe. Canada, there was fur, timber and wheat. In New Zealand, wool, dairy, sheep products. Argentina, cereals, beef and sheep. And in the United States, wheat and cotton. There were large flows of labour from Europe to these settler economies. So to illustrate this point, here I've got the percentage of foreign-born population in each of the 5 settler economies. And so you can see that, for example, in 1870-71, about half the Australian population, the European population, was foreign-born. In New Zealand, it was about 2/3 of the population which was foreign-born. In Canada, the United States and Argentina, all of which had larger sized populations, there was still a reasonably large foreign-born population, about 15 or 20%. And that strong foreign influence on population in fact persists through to the end of the 19th century. And you can see at the end of the 19th century still 1/3 to 2/5 of the population foreign-born in Australia and New Zealand, and the proportion of the population foreign-born in Argentina actually increasing. So the first year of globalisation, which brought large-scale migration, a lot of that migration was going to these settler economies, providing the workforce that was underpinning the production of the agricultural commodities that were being exported back to Europe. Foreign capital inflows were really important to settler economies as well. Here I've got a graph that shows the share of capital in Australia in the period from 1861 to 1913 that was financed by overseas borrowing. And so this line here is 50%. And so you can see that in some periods there's more than 50%, but in most periods there's certainly 40% or above of the capital that was being formed in Australia was being financed by overseas borrowing. So capital flows to the settler economies were an important element of economic activity. A distinctive feature of these settler economies was that they all became rich quickly after European colonisation, often referred to as being born rich. So they really had a distinctive approach to economic development compared to the European model of economic development, which we've talked about in the course up until now. That European model involved basically the transition over a long period of time from being an agricultural economy to being an industrial manufacturing economy. The settler economies were born rich. They didn't have that transition. They very quickly came to have high levels of GDP per capita based on the geographic suitability for supplying raw materials back to the Industrial Revolution, which was happening, or back to manufacturing industry in the Industrial Revolution, which was happening in Europe. Adam Smith was someone who early on realised that there was this distinctive path to development that was occurring in the settler economies. Smith said, "The colony of a civilised nation which takes possession either of a waste country or of one so thinly inhabited that the natives easily give place to the new settlers advances more rapidly to wealth and greatness than any other society." In this graph, what I've done is I've shown GDP per capita for the settler economies relative to Britain from 1820 through to 2010. And so in each year, Britain's GDP has been converted to be 100. So that means you can think of any point on this graph as being a particular country relative to Britain, or as a percentage of Britain's GDP per capita at that particular point in time. So for example, if we look sort of around about the 1840s and we're looking at the purple line, which is Australia, we see that in the 1840s Australia had GDP per capita that was about 60% of that in Britain. Now when you look at this graph, I think there's two things that stand out. One is that the different countries have sort of different paths in the 19th century, but pretty much by the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century, there's quite a close clustering of the GDP per capita of all the countries around British GDP. So this is the idea that these countries were born rich. In a relatively short period of time after European colonisation, all of them have progressed to have a GDP per capita which is sort of within a 10 or 20% band of Britain. The other thing you notice about the graph is that in the 20th century there's been a divergence within these settler economies. So you can see the United States moved ahead of Britain. You can see that Canada for a considerable amount of time moved ahead. You can see that Australia sort of basically remained on a par. You can see that Argentina fell away, and you can see that New Zealand, which remained on a par for a lot of the 20th century, after the 1970s has begun to fall away a bit. So I think when you look at the settler economies, there are really two big questions. How did they come to be rich so quickly? And secondly, what explains the differences after the early 20th century that have emerged? Now, one way of thinking about these questions is to use the framework of fundamental determinants that I talked about in the first lecture. And so one of those fundamental determinants was geography. And so it's certainly the case, as I've already described a bit, that the geography was an important factor in explaining why the settler economies rose so quickly to be rich countries. Basically, they all had geographies which were suitable to a greater or lesser degree for supplying foodstuffs, raw materials, which could be exported to Europe, which was increasingly specialising in manufacturing industry during and after the Industrial Revolution. So one big explanation in answer to the first question of how were they born rich is geography. Geography, though, I think can also explain something about the divergent paths the countries followed in the 20th century. For example, market size. So one thing we saw on the graph was that the US and Canada moved ahead of, for example, countries like Australia and New Zealand. And one big advantage that the US and Canada had over countries like Australia and New Zealand was that they were able to have a much larger domestic market to which manufacturing industry could supply. And one of the reasons for that is that they had a geography which meant that they could sustain larger populations. So the US and Australia, similar sort of land size, but 60% or a little bit more of the US is suitable for farming activity, whereas in Australia that proportion is only about 8%. So the capacity of the US to grow food to sustain a population much greater than in Australia. So the US ends up with a larger population, ends up being able to industrialise on a larger scale than Australia can. So geography can, via market size, I think can explain something about differences in, for example, the US and Canada and Australia and New Zealand. Another factor is access to mineral resources. So we've talked about how the US having access to mineral resources was important to it becoming an industrial power. Arguably one of the reasons why Australia has remained in the middle of the group of settler economies compared to, say, New Zealand and Argentina is the mineral resources that have been available to be extracted and sold in Australia, in particular in the middle of the 19th century, around the end, early 20th century, and then from the 1960s onwards in Australia. And New Zealand and Argentina haven't had those resources to anywhere near the same extent. Another factor is perhaps differences in staple exports. So it's often said that wool is a staple, which Australia sort of had as its predominant staple, that doesn't create a lot of extra linkages to other types of economic activity. Whereas wheat, which was Canada's staple, does create those type of linkages. So whereas most of Australia's wool was simply exported to Britain to be used in industrial manufacturing there, Canada's wheat, a lot of that wheat ended up being processed in Canada. And so you get a flour production manufacturing type industry being generated. So differences in what was the staple export in each of the countries can explain something about the nature of their economic development as well. The second fundamental determinant I want to talk about is contact with success. And here I think Barbara Solow in this quote has summarised a distinctive element about the settler economies that has something to say about the success. She said, if we define as the central question of colonial history, by what methods did Europeans solve the problem of exploiting overseas conquest in regions with abundant land? We improve our understanding of the peopling and development of colonial British America and of Latin America, South Africa, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. What Solow is pointing to is the fact that in these settler economies there was a distinctive approach to populating, to creating economic activity in those countries. And that approach was that basically a European population was transplanted to provide the workforce that would be used in the economic activity being undertaken. So the fact that there was the relatively low density of indigenous population, the fact that there was a disease environment that allowed Europeans to live in these settler economies without being at major risk of death, meant that the model that the European colonisers adopted for creating workforces in these countries was to basically take European populations as immigrants and put them in these countries. And that meant that there was always a strong connection between these countries and their European colonisers. So that meant that when the Industrial Revolution is underway and manufacturers are looking for sources of raw materials, these countries which have been colonised with European population were the natural place to look to supply those raw materials. So one influence of the connectedness was that these countries get tied in strongly to Europe just at the time when the Industrial Revolution is happening. And that's a huge advantage to them in terms of being able to generate income, because their main source of income was as suppliers of exports to the rest of the world. It also meant, as we've talked about, this contact with Europe, that there was a supply of capital, international capital flows, which could come to those countries because of the connection. And generally, sort of over time, the fact that there was this strong connection back to Europe meant that there was flows of knowledge about technology, flows of knowledge about what institutions work, and continuing flows of capital and labour that benefited the settler economies. So in answer to the first question about why these settler economies were successful, I think an important answer is that they had this strong connection back to Europe. I think the extent of connection can also say something about the divergences that we see in the 20th century. So for example, whereas countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand maintained strong linkages to the leaders, Britain and the United States, that wasn't always the case for Argentina and other Latin American countries. So in the period sort of from around about the middle of the 20th century, relations between the US and, for example, Argentina waxed and waned a lot depending on the nature of the government in Washington and the government in Argentina. And so whereas a country like Australia benefited a lot from technology transfer from foreign investment by American firms in Australia after World War II, there wasn't that same strong degree of connection between the US and Argentina. And that may be one factor that explains why Argentina fell behind. The other fundamental factor I want to talk about is institutions and policies. So I think one thing you can say about policies in all of the settler economies is that in the 19th century, the period when the settler economies were catching up to Britain, that the policies all worked in the direction of promoting the areas of economic activity that were the areas of comparative advantage for those settler economies. So promoting agricultural activity in places like Australia and Argentina, assisting to promote industrial activity in the United States. And there was a degree of flexibility of the policies that allowed them to adjust as economic opportunities changed. I think policy probably has something to say about the divergence in the 20th century as well. Again, to take the example of Australia and Argentina. So Australia's approach to trade protection has been described as an approach of protection all round. So Australia gave protection to manufacturing producers, but as a quid pro quo, because of the increase in costs that implied for agricultural producers, they also provided support in a variety of ways to agricultural producers. So they kept a level playing field in a way between those two sectors of the economy. Whereas in Argentina, policy was much more extreme. In the 19th century, there was a period where policy was very much directed towards the interests of the large landowners who were producing the agricultural goods, which was Argentina's comparative advantage. And so that directed the economy towards producing in its areas of comparative advantage. But after the Great Depression in Argentina, policy shifts towards favouring the urban-based manufacturing interests, and that was a period then when economic policy is directed towards activities in which Argentina didn't have a comparative advantage, and hence policy was disadvantaging Argentina during that period, and then potentially explaining Argentina's fall away in economic performance in the period during the 20th century. Other thing to mention is favourable institutions, that by and large the settler economies would be regarded globally as having had relatively favourable institutions. They were all countries where there were constitutions, parliamentary systems that imposed a relatively high degree of constraint on the executive, Argentina perhaps being an exception. They were all countries where there was a relatively high degree of security of property rights, high degree of security in commercial transactions, which meant that there was a limit on rent-seeking activity in the private part of the economy. And again, especially in Australia, the US, New Zealand and Canada, there was a relatively broad franchise, so that policy making was directed towards the interests of a broad group in society rather than to sort of narrow elite group in society. So in all those countries, for example, you get early adoption of public education systems. The final comment to make about the settler economies is that, of course, saying that there was a relatively low density of indigenous population doesn't mean there was no indigenous population. And it's important to recognise that in these settler economies as well, there was definitely a process by which these populations were displaced, killed, and marginalised in an economic sense. So, for example, in Australia, there were deaths of Indigenous population from disease brought to Australia, in particular smallpox. There was a process where, as the European population increasingly took up the land for agricultural activity, that the Indigenous population were displaced, and there was warfare between the Indigenous and European populations. And the dislocation that's caused has meant that there's been long-term disadvantage for Indigenous population in Australia and other countries. And so here I've got some data that just make that point, showing, for example, that from 1971 to 2006, the economic position of Indigenous population in Australia is in many regards sort of well below that of the white population. So, for example, having lower employment to population rates. So these numbers are all ratios of the Indigenous population compared to the white population. So this is saying, for example, that the employment population rate of the Indigenous population is only 70% of that of the white population. Lower median income, lower percentages of house owners, a higher percentage never attended school, and a much smaller percentage of population aged over 55 years, showing the much lower life expectancy of Indigenous population. The other thing to note is that apart from improvements in the percentage of Indigenous population who are attending school, a lot of these measures haven't changed, or in fact are moving in opposite to the direction of catching up. For example, there's actually been a reduction in the proportion of Indigenous population aged over 55 compared to the white population in Australia. So in talking about the economic success of these countries from a European perspective, it's also important always to put that in balance with the effect on the Indigenous population that the European colonisation had.